After many long months, the Overwatch League is finally back, with the opening weekend providing us a feast of excitement and entertainment as some of the teams open their 2021 accounts. Over the past few days, we've been treated to some fascinating matchups that saw plenty of teams really impress with some major upsets, whilst others previously hyped up before the season started found themselves struggling with ugly losses. Today then, on the back of my preseason power rankings last week, I'm going to post my first regular season power ranking update, split between the two regions. Unlike my last video though, this power ranking will more dramatically represent what I think a team's form and strength is within the current meta, based upon what they've currently shown, and only the teams we've actually seen play so far will be included. As a result, you may see certain teams rise or fall drastically from where I placed them a few days ago, although bear in mind that power rankings are often quite volatile at the start of a season, when we have very little to go off of, and my pre-season power ranking was more of an overall season assessment. So, with all that explained, let's dig into it then, starting with the East region, which I've ranked as follows. Beginning with the Valiant at the bottom, this shouldn't come as much of a surprise given their 2 losses on the opening weekend. However, it must be said that this team certainly performed better than many had previously predicted. Taking a map off of the Hunters was quite an impressive feat given the context of Chengdu's other victory, and there were periods during both of their series where the Valiant proved to be rather competitive, with Molanran in particular really standing out with some great displays. That said, they don't look quite the finished article. One could argue the success against the Hunters was more down to their opponents underperforming, and there were times where some poor team coordination from the Valiant was heavily punished by their superior opponents. As a result, I have to keep them at the bottom of the East, but with the note that they are much closer to the rest of the pack than I, or many others expected. Above them are the Guangzhou Charge, who funnily enough are lower in the league standings compared to the Valiant after 2 3-0 losses this past weekend. In many ways though, I think this is very harsh on the Charge, who actually played quite well against Shanghai, and even drew on one of the maps during their series. Choi Se-hwan in particular enjoyed some brilliant moments and was clearly Guangzhou's best player over the course of the weekend, but whilst he may have put in some great performances, others around him were significantly poorer. Mike Haley was invisible for a lot of the time he played, and the support line also didn't always produce a great showing. Now I wouldn't blame anyone for wanting to put the Charge below the Valiant after such rough losses, but like the Valiant, Guangzhou did have to play 2 very tough opponents in Seoul and Shanghai, and for now, given that I have more confidence in their tank line, it's enough for me to keep them higher. Next up, perhaps controversially, I've decided to place the Shanghai Dragons below the Seoul Dynasty. Now this is where I have to emphasise that this power ranking is based on the current form and strength within the meta, because overall I still have more confidence in the Dragons squad and their ability to bounce back moving forward throughout the season compared to the Dynasty. But looking at this weekend in isolation, I'm not sure how you can put Shanghai over Seoul. Both played the Charge, which is perhaps the best way to compare them, and clearly the Dynasty put on a stronger display here, convincingly dispatching Guangzhou, whereas the Dragons had a few bumps along the way to their own victory over them, which included a draw within their 3-0 scoreline. Then, when you look at their respective losses, in my opinion, Shanghai came out far worse from their ugly defeat to the Hunters, compared to what I thought was quite a close competitive series between Seoul and Philly. There were very few instances when I thought the Dragons were playing at the same level as Chengdu throughout their match. But by contrast, I would argue that the Dynasty did match the Fusion at many points, and it was only really by narrow margins that they ended up being defeated, suggesting that they themselves are almost at the same level. As I've alluded to, just based on the 2 matches they've played, I feel like we saw higher highs from Seoul and lower lows from Shanghai over this past weekend, and consequently, that's why I've had to rank them in this way, although as I say, this may quickly change in the next couple of weeks, so don't get too caught up on this ranking for now. As for the top of this East region power ranking, in the end I decided to place the Philadelphia Fusion at number 1, with the Chengdu Hunters slotted in behind them, a decision I'm sure many of you would potentially flip. Both of these teams enjoyed a fantastic opening to the season, and if they continue to play at their best, they could definitely be establishing themselves as the teams to beat in the East this year. The reason why I've got Philly ahead of Chengdu, however, comes down to 2 reasons. First of all, as I've ranked Seoul above Shanghai, simply the Fusion in my eyes have defeated the stronger opponent, with both these teams playing the Valiant in their other series. The second reason, which is more important though, is my reservations regarding the Chengdu zone. Now I could spend plenty of time looking at all the brilliant performances from the Chengdu players, in particular during the Shanghai fixture, where players like Gaga, Leaf and Monk were all outstanding, and as a little tease I'll be discussing them more in detail tomorrow. However, their win over the Valiant has raised a couple of concerns for me. Admittedly, I expect that the Hunters didn't take their opponents as seriously during this series compared to the one against the Dragons, but this inconsistency in display, with the Valiant even managing to pick up a map in this series, worryingly reminds me of the Chengdu of old. Yes, they look to be considerably improved at the moment, but the top teams need to be ruthless in these sorts of matchups against weaker opposition, and this is where Philly's comparative dominance over the Valiant leads to their higher placing, with all the members of the Fusion lineup seriously impressing during both of their wins, and Rascal, Hotbar and Toby in particular clearly showing us they're not going to hold this team back whilst Philly's European starters are currently stuck with visa issues. So that's my run through of my Week 2 East region power ranking. So now let's travel over the Pacific and see how I've ranked the West region. Again, it shouldn't come as much of a surprise to see the Vancouver Titans in the bottom spot, given my previous feelings about this roster, and after their 2-loss opening week. To be fair to Vancouver, they didn't play as bad as I would have thought, but they had some competitive moments during both of their series, with Fried Wiener especially standing out after some really good play at off-tank, so there is definitely some room for optimism with the Titans despite their last place placing. Atlanta above them is less a reflection of them being comparable to Vancouver, but instead on the back of 2 tough losses to teams I don't necessarily rank near the top of the West right now. After thinking about it, there are a lot of positives to come out from the Reign this past weekend. Their rush when fully clicking was excellent, and Kai had some ridiculously pop-off moments. But any time they moved away from the rush comps, the quality of this team seemed to fall completely off the face of the planet, with the tank and support lines in particular showing a lot of weakness, whilst the team also struggled in tracer duels. Ultimately, it's a shame to say this, but so far from what we've seen, Atlanta just look like a team that can only succeed one-tricking rush comps, and lack the flexibility needed to win against competitive competition. Add to that the issue of coaching that I feel once again reared its ugly head in how quickly this team got boomed in their reverse sweeps of the Defiant, and I think you can see the major problems facing the Reign right now, leaving me little choice other than ranking them this low. Speaking of Toronto though, they come next in my power ranking, which I'm sure is going to annoy a lot of people given their 2-0 record. But hear me out for a minute, I promise I'm not a Defiant hater. Yes, the team won both of their games, but against who? The teams I've ranked in the West bottom 2. Yes, certain players put on some brilliant displays over the weekend. Sado on the support line had some great moments, whilst Hisu and Michelle were the real stars with brilliant displays during both of their series. However, let's be really objective here. The minute they made any subs to their lineup, they became comparable to the Titans, losing a map to them in that instance. And had Dorado gone slightly differently, we're talking about Toronto losing 3-0 to Atlanta, and clearly being the second worst team in the region of those that have played so far. Look, I get that Hisu popping off can carry this team to great heights if the players around him play up to their potential, but right now, I'm still not sold, and need to be convinced by matches against tougher opposition. Some of you may look to the Gladiators being ranked above them despite losing both of their opening games, and wonder why that is. Aside from my doubts about the Defiant, the main reason the Gladiators remain this high is because I think they faced some really tough competition over this past weekend. As you can see from the rest of this ranking, I still think the Shock is the number 1 team in the West, and I don't think Dallas is bad themselves, hence me being a little lenient on LA and not dropping them right to the bottom after their high preseason expectations. That said, this was undoubtedly a poor week for the Gladiators, with nothing really clicking across the team. Concerningly, Moth also had a really tough time, being on the bench when LA actually won their 2 maps. Perhaps they need a little more time to gel before they can fulfill their potential and preseason expectations, but things will need to be addressed very quickly, with some must-win matches against Boston and London coming up next week. Funnily enough, the hardest part of my power rankings this week came with the ranking of the next 2 teams, and in the end I settled on the Dallas Fuel below the Florida Mayhem. To be honest, I pretty much have these teams neck and neck, and there are certainly very valid arguments for having Dallas higher. They gave Houston a very challenging time to start the week, before securing the massive upset victory over the Gladiators, with Phyllis and Sparkle playing incredibly well, showing why people rate the pair so highly. This all the while they don't even have a hit scan player after the departure of Exy. Florida meanwhile picked up an impressive victory over Atlanta, and whilst a bit scrappy, took care of Vancouver. In many ways, as I'm talking about it, I'm leaning more and more towards having Dallas higher, especially considering the OG had a very up and down weekend. However, the lack of a hit scan player does still concern me moving forward for Dallas, and we still don't have a good gauge of LA's current strength. For all we know, they could be even worse than Atlanta. As for Florida, Yaki and Gargle were excellent during both of their series, and deserve particular mention, but the reason I'm going to keep them higher is because of their support line of Slime and Gangnam Jin. The pair quietly enjoyed a really strong weekend, turning up clutch in some really important moments throughout both of their series. In my opinion, they certainly performed better than their counterparts on the Fuel, and this is the only reason that I've decided to edge them just higher. Lastly, there's the top 2, the San Francisco Shock and the Houston Outlaws, clearly the best 2 teams that played in the West region this past weekend. Now I know what people are going to say. The Outlaws played the Shock and beat them, so how can you rank San Francisco higher? These rankings are trash. Hear me out. After watching the series again, Houston was top draw. You couldn't have asked for anything more for them. Happy, Django, Crimzo, all the players even, were outstanding. For me though, the Shock were far from their best, and honestly looking back, will still feel they should have come away with the victory here despite this. I personally believe that if you play the series another 10 times, the Shock is probably coming away with the victory at least 7 or more times, and as a result I still have to rate them as a stronger team, hence my final ranking as it is. But at the end of the day, that's just my opinion for this week, so let me know what you think down in the comments below. But on that note, we've reached the end of this our Week 2 Power Rankings video, so if you have enjoyed, please be sure to leave a like and subscribe, and follow me on Twitter if you haven't already. I'll be back tomorrow with another new video series, so until then I want to say a big thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.